There are reasons why the United States does not look at aviation accidents, true accidents, through a criminal lens. Sure, if a pilot flies drunk or somebody hijacks and crashes a plane, those are criminal matters. We know little about the details about these subpoenas other than the probe is looking at how the plane was certified as well. But now takes the MAX investigation to a different level. How unusual is that?
Highly unusual. It's not without precedent, but it's highly unusual.
James Anderson is an attorney with the Aviation Law Group in Seattle. From Indonesia to Ethiopia, back to the fact the plane was designed by Boeing in the U.S. and certified by the U.S. government under the FAA, with the National Transportation Safety Board providing technical assistance, it is complicated.
I think it's always messy. The additional layer of messiness, though, is that we've got this potential criminal investigation starting, and that's something that is unusual. What's ordinary is the NTSB going into other countries and rendering assistance, and manufacturers such as Boeing going into other countries and rendering assistance when one of their products is at issue. That's usual. What's unusual is the grand jury subpoena and how that plays in with international law and our domestic policy here.
He says the U.S. tradition is to solve accidents more quickly by not threatening to put people in jail. The idea is if the cause of the crash can be pinned down, we can prevent a similar crash from happening again. But if things go criminal, that, says Anderson, makes it difficult.
And one of the big concerns is whether witnesses are going to be interested in helping out if they're under a criminal investigation, or whether they would invoke, for example, the Fifth Amendment and refuse to answer questions because they're perhaps a criminal suspect.
But there was a case, the 1996 case of ValueJet, a DC-9 that caught fire and crashed into the Everglades outside of Miami. There was a criminal side to that because of an undeclared load of flammable oxygen generators which was shipped as cargo. Anderson says that was a distraction. He's not connected with any part of these MAX investigations, to be clear. But it's also important to note that the tradition both here in the U.S. and Canada is similar. We also manufacture a lot of planes here, but in other countries it actually starts, such as France, it starts with a criminal probe, and actually the courts end up driving a lot of those investigations, and it's not just there, in many other countries around the world.
I think this was mentioned, but there are so many moving parts in this investigation, and now, obviously the FAA has been a big part of this, and you have more on that as well.
Right, layer upon layer. Today we now have the nomination of a permanent FAA administrator, an executive from Delta Airlines. He's Steve Dixon, who headed safety at the airline. Big airline, is a former Air Force fighter pilot. So he seems to have a lot of background. His name came up last year, but now it's been formalized. So
all right,
we'll see where it goes.
Yeah.
Glenn, thanks.
Totally.
Thank you.